we're going to continue the data theme this afternoon with a final panel in this session as we head up to lunch. Now, the theme for this panel is making data useful, and the core question is how and when does it become useful? Please welcome Martin Tugwell, Chief Executive at Transport for the North. Martin.
Thank you.
There we are. Thank you. Lawrence Oakes-Ash, Chief Executive with City Science, forgive me. Miranda Sharp, founder of Metis Digital. Miranda, welcome. And Lauren Sager-Weinstein, Chief Data Officer at Transport for London. Please welcome our panel, everybody. Thank you for coming. You're most welcome. Panel, could I just ask you to briefly introduce yourselves and give an example of a great application where data creates value, please?
I'll kick off if you like. I'm Martin Tugwell, Chief Executive Transport for the North. If you're not familiar with Transport for the North, we are a statutory body charged by government in producing a transport plan for the North of England and advising government on how to prioritise investment. And we do that through our strategic transport plan. And now we're just about to begin consultation on our next version of the transport plan. It will begin in mid-May. You'll see a transition from where we were in our earlier version of the plan. You'll see a greater focus around outcomes that are place-based and are user-centred. And that's very deliberate. And it reflects the work we've done in terms of the evidence base around the economy, the environment. And what I was going to use here, Nicola, is the example of transport-related social exclusion, because for the first time we've gone out and combined information around index of multiple deprivation with primary research. And we've produced an assessment of the level and risk of being excluded from society because either people don't have access to transport or they can't afford it. And that, for me, shines a light on a really important thing, which kind of follows on from something, because I think alongside the challenge of climate change and carbon is the challenge of equity. Because across the North, that research tells me we've got 3.3 million people, over 20% of our population, are living in areas of high risk of being excluded from society. It's the coastal towns, the former manufacturing areas. Why is that important? I don't think we give them enough priority when we're thinking about the solutions, their needs, as Sarah Sharp was mentioning this morning about different people, different needs. So that for me is why it's so important to shine a light in a different way on these areas of our communities.
Thank you very much, Martin. Lawrence, coming to you.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Oakes-Ash. I'm CEO of City Science. So we work with local authorities, SDBs and national government, really focused around decarbonisation, and everything to do with decarbonisation involves data. But I think it's also important to see that actually, for me, it's about what questions you ask. You know, you've got to ask the right questions first, then the data comes in, but also a huge amount of modelling, a huge amount of kind of forecasting and consideration of uncertainty is key to making those decisions. So I would really say that we're more interested in decision support than data. Data is just an input into that kind of whole decision process.
Thank you. Miranda.
Thank you very much. Well, hello everybody. I'm Miranda Sharp and I run Metis Digital, where we work with commercial clients, but I'm also on the board of the Transport Research Laboratory, so very interested in transport data from that perspective. I have the huge honour of chairing a part of the Digital Transformation Task Group, which is part of the Infrastructure Clients Group, where I work with infrastructure owners about digital transformation. And I'm also, in my spare time, working with the Open Data Institute, where we have this week published our report on the value of sharing data, the economic and the social value of sharing data. So that's what I'm going to talk about mostly today. I think one of the examples, data is always useful when it's used. The interesting question to ask is, where is data missing? And to follow on from Martin's exclusion point, there was a lot of data which didn't exist as we went into the pandemic, but there was certainly no data around people in care homes. And it was disaggregated and in all sorts of different places. And as a result, because we weren't able to describe and measure and see the impact on that population, they suffered disproportionately. So it's look for where the data, but also where it isn't.
Thank you, Miranda. Lauren, the floor is yours.
Hi, I'm Lauren Sager-Weinstein. I'm our Chief Data Officer at Transport for London. And my job within TfL is to think about, again, how do we use data, how do we make it useful, how do we ask the right questions, and also how do we make sure we're going to take action, right? So that not only are we asking a good question, will we do something with this information? So I have been working in the sort of the data field here for a long time, but I'll pick one example that is one of my favorites because it was really early on in the early days of what do we do with data that we might have. And we were persuading, I was persuading my colleagues and sort of the bus planning team that, hey, we have an option to sort of think about moving from a paper-based survey where we'd hand out a paper survey to everybody on a bus once every 5 years per route. And suddenly we said, could we do something with data we had from ticketing? Could we think about applying an algorithm? Could we build it? Could we test it? And actually we did, and it was an early success, but it's one that is not as complicated as we could do and as we do now, but it is one that is part and parcel to the way we operate in our organization. It's a tool that we call ODX. It helps us plan our bus services by understanding where our customers are going and how our buses are running from a customer perspective. And what is success about that and why it's useful is that in the forming of what's the sort of the data task, it was very much working with the sort of the operational teams that were planning a specific Route 82 or Route 13 or et cetera. And then being able to sort of say, how does this tool work for you? How do we sort of demonstrate is there value in it? And it's being used every day. In fact, I got an email this morning saying, oh, the data wasn't available last night. Can we make sure that we sort of get this stuff up and running? That's not, and my job is to make sure that we have tools that are fit for purpose, and it's exciting to me that it is up and running now. It's exciting to me that we have it part and parcel to what we're using for it every day, and that's success to me.
Thank you so much. Now, of course, you can see we've got a terrific panel. There's loads of incredible experience and expertise. So do get your questions to them directly. #interchange is the way you do it. Thank you. Now, to kick off, should we have a look individually at the value from data? How do we individually look at the value of that? Who'd like to take that one?
Well, can I?
Please do.
So go to our report, go to the ODI and read our report. Talk to us about it. We're keen to develop and be challenged and be wrong and learn. And we have come at it from the angle of we're not very interested if your data is more valuable than my data. We've heard many times today, none of us is as smart as all of us. So we're very interested in the data which can be accessed by increasing the accessibility of data. Do you know it exists? Can you use it? Have we got the right permissions? And we want to design appropriate access models that address the risks of sharing data, because as soon as you start to talk about sharing data, the conversation tends to be dominated by the CFO, who's extremely worried about the 4% fine of global turnover, which is at risk if you share data inappropriately. So we need to design access models with the technology and with the human factors to divine a fair and safe access system that addresses the security risks, cybersecurity and physical security, but also the risks of not sharing. So we need to design better access systems, and then we need to imagine what a fair exchange of value is. Because doing all those access systems is not cheap, it's not free, and it's not trivial. So how do we incentivize those people to make the right investments so that those who are going to benefit, and I'm not talking about purely financial benefit, there are all sorts of benefits, as Martin alluded to, from greater access to information. How do we incentivize the people that are going to need to invest so that those who are going to reap the rewards can continue to do so?
If I might build on that, it comes back, I think, when you talk about value, it comes back to the point Lawrence makes. I think it's about defining the question. And I think what you're seeing, particularly not just with Transport for the North, but with the other subnational transport bodies, we are getting into understanding that the data sets allow us to understand the communities, the businesses that we're developing solutions for in a way that we haven't been able to do before. So a number of us are starting to look at how you use personas to think about how you understand current behaviors. But it's painting this picture of where we're trying to get to. Now, the biggest challenge, arguably, for public sector policy is that quite often, and we've already touched on it, the people who are going to get the benefits are not actually the people who are necessarily going to make the cost or the investment. So you might make an investment in how you deliver public services. It will have a consequential impact on travel demand. But where the costs and the benefits, at the moment, we don't have that ability to take that picture of society and how do we put this value on. And I think that's where these sorts of events are really quite important, because we need to have new partnerships and relationships to achieve that.
Martin, did you want to pick up on that at all?
Yeah, Lawrence, I'd like to just, I'll probably sound a bit like a broken record, because I do think it is all about the question, and I think that value comes from solving problems. So it could be someone has a problem that they want to decarbonise, or someone who's got a particular business objective. Our goal really is to work with those individuals or their organisations to pin down that question and then see how that can be answered in order to deliver value. And I don't think there's one size fits all in terms of where value comes from. It has to be led by the problems that have value in their own right.
Forgive me, Lawrence. Did anybody want to pick up on that, Lawrence's point at all? We can go to a question. Thank you for sending your questions in to hashtag Interchange. Now we have, where should we go? We heard earlier that 90% of data isn't even looked at. How should we agree what data needs sharing to reduce infobesity whilst ensuring the right data is shared? Who'd like to take that?
Well, for me, it kind of builds on what I was saying earlier. And just so those of you who maybe know me longer will know I originally started as a transport modeler. So I built transport models, Lawrence, in the past. I wouldn't claim to be able to do it anymore. But I think a lot of it does come down to framing the question. I've seen too many examples where we've kind of tried to use all the data. We've tried to answer so many questions. And I remember, I've told this tale to a couple of people already today, about when I was running multimodal studies 20 odd years ago, we had guidance published from the department about that. And the thing that really stuck in my mind was this definition of what makes a robust decision. Because we've got to think at the end of the day, this is about making decisions. It's about whether it's political or private sector making decisions. And it's having enough data and enough information defined by question that allows that decision maker to make it knowing, do you know what, if I had more information, I'd still make that decision. So I think it's about understanding the humanity and the decision making that actually allows us to say, well, actually, that's not relevant. And again, I've often talked about how in the public sector, we need to own the problem, but we mustn't try and own the solution. And I think sometimes with data, we try to do both. And actually, I think there's examples here where the richness in the entrepreneurs and the innovators is actually help define the question we're asking for answers for, and then work with them to develop that.
Thank you. Lawrence?
I'd probably challenge, I mean, I wouldn't worry so much about that statistic, but I'd put some other statistics in its place, because I would say that I use 90% of the data that I use is the same data all the time. And when we've done these sorts of analyses in the past, we did a data audit for a local authority, and we found that 50% of the data that they were using was from the ONS anyway, and 90% or 80 to 90% was from government agencies. So most of the data that people are using is from these sorts of sources. And then when we've looked at open data portals that try to share data, there's data sets on there like the number of picnic tables, which they may be relevant to a particular question, but they're not relevant to the majority of the questions that I've got to ask, unless there's somebody who has got a particular desire to know where to eat their sandwich.
Lauren, did you want to pick up on that?
I mean, I would agree. I think that I think that it's really there's always an element about trying to define the question, and that can be complicated. I think there are areas that are we're very clear on, and there's very clear data that we want. We should make sure that data is sort of curated and understood for the purpose it's sort of being used. There are a few areas, and Miranda mentioned this, where we just feel like we don't have the sort of the data. We don't necessarily know what that data is. We're still sort of searching for the sort of the questioned, the data to match the question. I think there's still some questions that we're still trying to figure out what is the sort of the policy question, where we haven't even formulated that question properly. So I think that starting with saying, okay, what are our outcomes we want to achieve? What do we need to know to make that good decision? What is the data that is suitable for that evidence? Are we confident in that data? That's the way I would sort of approach the question, and I think that's sort of the best way forward for us.
Miranda.
So I love the term infobesity. Thank you very much.
It's a good one.
And I'm just thinking about the amount of waste there is in organisations when we follow the track of just, if we had more data, the world would be a better place. And buying technology that we think will produce data and then never using it. And the amount of information rework that causes and waste and slowness in an organisation manifested by competing teams sort of emailing spreadsheets to each other. If we thought smartly about the data we use, the data we need, and the data we produce, and how we can work off common data sources, so we reduce that information lag and rework in the organisation, we would make a huge contribution to UK productivity.
And that requires just a maturity, right? How do we learn from each other? It's, this is a new field. Although we have a long history of, being very statistically focused, particularly in the transport arena, having sort of good sort of evidence. I did mention the surveys. Again, at the time, that was the best data we had. But how do we sort of, learn and use best practice and sort of organize ourselves in a structured, professional way to, so keep track of the data that we have, maintain it, and sort of understand it.
Thank you for your questions, actually. We'll get to how do we make data reusable for new applications and unlock an innovation ecosystem around this reuse. That's at #interchange if you want to ask another question. Who'd like to take that?
Go on, Lawrence, you know how.
Well, I'm just going to say something controversial, I think, which is that we've got lots of data that is still hard to get, and I'm sure Miranda will tell me it's not the case, but I think, for example, Ordnance Survey data is still far too hard to get, and these are agencies that are owned by government. So I think that there's a lot of assets in the UK that we could make much more easily accessible, that I think would be the sorts to be reused. I think the big kind of challenges here are around commercial data, and there is a cost. There is a cost to any of this data. So in the UK, obviously, organisations like Ordnance Survey, who have lots of data, have a budget to produce that data, and I think that where you've got commercial operators such as the mobile network operators, they also want a return on what they're investing in processing the data as well. So I think that I think we should make open the things which are still remaining in the UK, but I don't know how we do it for those commercial data sets. I think we just need to accept that people are going to have to make some kind of money in order. There is a cost to curating that.
David, want to come back?
Well, I think we just need to be really mature and open to new commercial models. There are really good risks. There are real risks involved in making data open. And as somebody who's building an organisation on open data, the risk is if I accept data that was published openly and therefore thrown over the fence and forgotten about, the risk is if you change your specification, then my business becomes untenable. And there's a real difference in the open data world between free speech and free beer. One's a universal good, one perhaps less so. And we need to have better conversations about the commercial value of data and the beneficiaries and investors, as I said before. And at the moment, we're sort of stuck in the model where, well, it's all free, isn't it? And if I want the Wi-Fi, I'm happy to give away my first child. We just don't have a greater maturity, as Lauren said, about the transaction that's involved in the sharing of data. And we hope that we're on the journey towards that.
Martin, were you
Well, I
about
was
to
just
say
thinking
something?
that this comes back to me about understand. For me, this comes back to also this problem about where costs and benefits rest. So we know in this country we've got an aging population. There are parts of districts where within a matter of 5 or 10 years, the population will be majority of retirement age.
Yeah.
We know from experience that access to information, if you maintain those people's independent living for longer, they'll have better quality of life, which means your demand on social care and healthcare will be significantly different. But if your choice about how you invest to keep transport enabling them to be mobile, the benefits of that investment is realised in the health service and social services.
Absolutely.
So this is where we've really got to start thinking, and we've touched on it a little bit with Sarah again this morning, about systems integration, systems thinking. What needs to be true in other parts of society to enable us to realise our ambitions, our requirements around transport? Because again, I think we've I suppose my challenge back to those in the data world is I'm interested in understanding where we are. But my political leaders are looking, and people like the NIC are looking at 20, 30 years ahead. We're painting a picture of where we need to be. So it's how do we use the data to build the narratives, to build the stories that allows the change that we're requiring to meet those obligations and expectations.
And I think there's an important point there, because I think in some cases the historic data doesn't represent that world that we want to move to. And that's a challenge when people are looking for evidence. If you're looking at historic data, that evidence might not exist.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to framing the question, right? I think that's the task. So we need to sort of say, from a sort of an overarching sort of public government and governance perspective, as a society, how do we want to be thinking about things? What are the outcomes? What are the collaborations? What are the sort of the trade-offs we want to make? And that should first of all lead us to sort of guiding the questions, guiding the sort of the costs of the different sort of alternatives, and then I think data can help as an evidence base. But I think it also then we need to be clear about what data is not going to help. What data can answer today's question? It is much, much harder to sort of predict tomorrow. We can do a little bit of it. We can do a lot of clever modeling, and we should. But I think we need to be sort of clear on the limitations of what we have.
Okay, all right. Somebody has asked a question here about the holy grail of amalgamating data sets into usable outputs for the transportation networks of the country. So how would you define, sorry, I beg your pardon, what would you define as the holy grail of amalgamating data sets into usable outputs for the transportation networks of the country?
Well, I'm tempted to go back to Paul Campion when he said a minute ago there are 10 types of people in the world, those that understand binary questions and those that don't. So I think there is no holy grail. I think the challenge is to build a coalition of the interested and the willing, who have a stake in solving a problem, and are going to benefit from the result of doing so, and getting them to work together to talk about what they want, and then we help measure the difference between where we are and where we're going. And I think that comes back to your question, actually, Martin. No, I don't think we're going to get there one step at a time, because there's no one customer for amalgamated transport, apart from perhaps Lauren. But
well, even so, I mean, we do have, there's data that we don't have, but somehow we have to sort of say, what's the question? What will we do with it? And the risk is for data people is we can get very excited about the potential without being very clear and precise about what we're going to try and do. And I think I agree, there's not one magic data set. Although I do say I am very lucky that we do have a very rich set of data. So I acknowledge that.
So I come back to the point I made previously, which is when I use data, I'm probably using 90%. 90% of the data I'm using is the same. And the reason it's the same is because I'm doing the same processes, or our team's doing the same processes. So I think the holy grail is we know what those broad processes are. We know what data's being used. Can we automate those processes to make it really cheap and efficient and more democratized? So I'm really passionate about the idea that we can, for example, automate the production transport models. That's what I'd love to see. I'd love to democratize it and make it more open and make it more available. So that's what I'd say.
I kind of would build on, so I'm lucky in that I've got an incredible team of analysts and modelers. I've probably got one of the biggest teams, I think, probably certainly at a regional level and arguably in some of the local authorities. So we've got capabilities about regional models, whether it's road, rail, and we've now got buses coming into this. But we kind of, because we're focusing on outcomes, we've been doing some work around EV charging infrastructure. So the conversation we're having is, we've had it with National Grid, the Energy Savings Trust, the DNOs, the energy system operators, so that when we're painting a picture as to, and we've mapped again at a fairly fine level across the entire north, an understanding of where the current demand is, where the fleets are, where the opportunities are, where the current networks are. You have a conversation which not only talks about how do you make it accessible for people to have infrastructure, the chargers, but how you start having a conversation with the regulators about empowering the DNOs and the energy generators to make their investment, so that actually when you put the chargers in, so it's not about holy grail, it's about defining the question, having a way of thinking and an approach, which I have to say I love Arthur C. Clarke. You know your history. You know he was the guy who postulated about GPS satellites just after the Second World War. And look, science fiction is an ambition of where we want to be. So framing the question and then having the skills like we are today here to go and talk to people that you might not have talked to before.
And that's a good point to pick up on, actually, because we've had an interesting question. As an industry, they're all interesting, obviously, but it just links in, segues beautifully into this question here. As an industry, are we capturing enough data on marginalised groups to make informed decisions and ensure we don't exclude people from our transport system?
Can I take that?
Yes,
So,
please do.
so this is something actually I've been doing a lot of thinking about, and it's something we care about within Transport for London. We've had conversations. This is where I think that we absolutely, as an industry and as a society, need to be very transparent about how we're using data, because the only way that we can sort of get personal data to really understand the needs and the characteristics of communities that we have overlooked, marginalized communities, is by building up the trust and being trustworthy and honoring the data that people share with us. And so step one is absolutely being sort of fundamental, that we are going to sort of encourage people to share information with us, and we're going to respect and treat with the utmost sort of security, protection, ethics of the data that people are sharing, because I think that has to be fundamental. Otherwise, we're not going to have that license to operate. And then I think at that point, I think it's really making sure that we're clear on what are the outcomes. How do we think about an equitable world? We talked about this groups that are not included, groups that are sort of don't have access to the network, groups that don't feel safe. So I think there's a lot. So there's a lot we should just do anyway without the data, and we just should sort of start with that sort of those principles. But I think that being able to sort of set the sort of standards about being sort of proper, trustworthy, sort of safe holders of people's data is fundamental.
Miranda.
Yeah, and absolutely, and we should not use regulation or legals to be our guide on this, because the law and the official ethics codes will always lag behind what the people in your organisation or the people in your ecosystem are already telling you. So thinking about the ethics and doing what is right more than what is legal, I think is a great way on a step towards creating an ecosystem which is comfortable and sure in when it shares data.
And I think this for me, Lauren, this thing about gaining the trust and the confidence of people to be able to have that conversation, I think is really powerful for me. I mean, I'll just as a little plug, I've talked about the transport-related social exclusion work. If you'd like to come and see a little bit more about that, come along to our own STB conference in June, because we're going to be showcasing that and demonstrating it firsthand. But it's about being able to, I challenge my colleagues sometimes. If our response to decarbonising the transport system is an over-focus on EVs, which cost, 50 grand? How are you going to have a conversation with a single parent on minimum wage in the gig economy in Redcar?
Exactly.
And that's where we've got to get the trust, that we're actually listening and understanding what it is that they need to and can afford in many instances. It's an equity issue. And I think that's a really powerful point you've made, Lauren.
Yeah, okay. All right. Did anybody want to come back on anything that Martin's...
I think probably
Yes.
within marginalised groups, there's a huge amount of diversity as well.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so I think I think that it's very difficult to even know who we're not thinking about.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big challenge, because I think every single group within that bracket that we've put there is going to have individual needs. And I think that's the challenge, but also something where it makes it far harder to get the data if that's what we need to do.
Yeah. Okay, absolutely. We've got a good question, another good question here. They're all good. They're all good. How do we address the inequality between urban and rural data availability in order to ensure peripheral regions don't get left behind? Where are we going?
I don't think there is a difference. I think it's about how you use it and how you focus it. So all the data that we're doing and all the information we map, it's done across the entire north. And that's why we know that the challenge on social exclusion is around the coastal communities, former manufacturing. It's not surprising where these are. But equally, we can look at and understand if we go back EV charging, we understand what the opportunities, what the population are in certain areas. Now, for me, Nicola, that means we can have a different conversation, because I'm sure there'll be plenty of providers of charging infrastructure who would love to be able to go and put everything they need to in Greater Manchester, West Yorkshire and what have you. I'm interested in having a conversation with those people about, okay, well, if you're going to do that, how are you going to help us provide it in some of the more rural parts? So again, I think it's about having bodies like Transport for the North, which can take that bigger picture, which can say, we've set some really challenging goals around the environment, the economy and society. There will be opportunities, better opportunities in some of the larger urban areas, but how do we make sure we bring the peripheral areas and the more rural areas alongside us? And that, again, is a different conversation with the private sector and the providers of this infrastructure. But it's about having data and the information available at the first level.
I think it probably comes back to asking the right question again.
Yeah.
And I think that actually the question here is, how do we level up investment, not necessarily data? I imagine that actually the author of that question probably doesn't want more data, probably wants more investment in rural areas. And the challenge with getting more investment is one in terms of how we do business cases, how we do the values we attribute to the social outcomes, and how that is biased towards urban areas. So I think I'd probably reframe the question, and then there's a different answer.
Yeah.
Miranda.
So I think there's an interesting parallel here when we look at telco provision, for example. So it's as you both say, it's about the investment and the outcomes. So when we were looking at telco mobile phone provision and data provision about people in cities, in smart city world, the telcos are all falling over themselves to provide connectivity services in places like Paternoster Square and the City of London. And really not very far away in the social housing, there was very poor connectivity, very poor information provision, and yet the greatest saving that could be identified in the public sector from people being connected was keeping Granny out of A&E, was picking information up about Granny when she was poorly, when she didn't get out of bed on time, when she didn't boil the kettle or whatever. And the business case didn't add up to extend connectivity, and this is digital connectivity rather than physical connectivity, didn't extend into her housing. And we've done something wrong with the business case, as you say, in quantifying the social value, if we haven't thought through about the costs of inequality. And that's where I think we need to think.
And just an example of how subnational transport bodies are helping bridge this gap. In my former role, I looked after England's economic heartland. Go and visit the people on the East-West Rail Stand. It's a project very dear to my heart. But the section they're delivering at the moment between Bicester and Bletchley, they're laying a fibre optic cable for signalling along that route. We said, hang on a minute, what's the marginal cost of making it a bigger cable and then running 5G stations in this rural part of Buckinghamshire? And it worked out at an incredibly marginal cost of doing this. DFT weren't interested at the time because it's not transport. DCMS weren't interested because it's a transport project. You had subnational thinking, looking at outcomes, saying, well, look, let's just do this. And guess what? It's being delivered. And you're going to get not just the railway being built, but 5G coverage in rural areas, which are actually going to help deliver services and improve quality and actually give people options for living in that area. It's the sort of systems thinking coming to life.
And I just wanted to give the final word to you. Is there anything you wanted to add to that at all, Lauren?
I think these are great examples. I guess I would like to change the conversation just a little bit, because I think that there is an opportunity for us to think ahead also about skills, right? So how do we build digital and data skills for us as a community? And when I think about, how do we sort of close the divide going forward, that means how do we sort of, the industry is changing, as I mentioned before. Skills, for everybody is something that we need to think about. How do we prioritize? And so we've been thinking about the examples of where do we in the transport sector think about other sort of provisions of public services. I think there's a discussion to be had about how do we how do we sort of work across sort of government agencies, across sort of public-private sectors, community to sort of to encourage skills both for people who want to be practitioners in data, because to be able to sort of frame questions, work on data, do the analysis, but also just to how to consume it. So how do we make decisions? How do we understand? There's a term that we're using called digital fluency. And it ranges from sort of educating, really people who are not sort of who've been excluded from society, but it also includes people who have a lot of privilege but never had the need to sort of to look at data in the same way as the world is changing. So I think that's another area I would be keen for us to think about how do we engage collectively on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience as well for your, for all of your questions to make this that panel really come alive. And panel, I'm very grateful to you for spending the time with us this afternoon. Let's give them a great round of applause. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.